There are a few topics which can make me wish, as much as I do, that I have more shelf space than this one. This is the Royal Navy's Interwar Destroyers. This is how did the Royal Navy maintain the fighting edge, the aggression that had set apart their destroyers in World War I through the 1920s and 30s. And this is actually something which is really worthwhile studying today and thinking about today, because if you think about this, there is now longer between today and the Falklands War than there was between the Falklands War and World War II. In both those periods, we have had trouble maintaining in Britain, and not just Britain, but also the whole world has the similar issue of maintaining the fighting edge of our fleets, maintaining that fighting experience, because the trouble is navies have so much to do in peacetime. It's very easy for them to lose that edge and concentrate on the peacetime deterrence duties, on the maritime security duties, and lose the fighting edge. It is very easy for them to do it, because they basically have to do so much in peacetime. It's almost their job gets more complicated in peacetime than in wartime. In wartime, it's rather simple. They see an opponent, they shoot them. In peacetime, they see an opponent, they have to watch them, they have to mirror them, they don't want to reveal too much of their capabilities while trying to watch for all their capabilities. They have to do diplomacy with them. They have to do so many more complicated things than just, we have target, engage. But you've still got to maintain that skill so that when you do get into wartime, you have that drive to target and engage. And realistically, a lot of what the Royal Navy does in the 1920s and 30s is about harnessing the innate aggression and maintaining it, maintaining the Harwich ethos. And yes, there'll be a shameless book plug in this video, but of course, the reason I'm so keen on it is destroyers in the 1920s and 30s. My PhD is on development of naval aviation, on development of aircraft carriers and air power, and how the Royal Navy did it, because, well, it got so big I had to drop the Japanese and American sections. But alongside that, I was also kept looking into these destroyers, and I got fed up with books which kept saying, and 12 destroyers. Which destroyers? What destroyers? Because that makes a difference. Destroyers aren't all the same. They're all quite different, and we're going to be talking about this. There's a reason this video is actually not going to get into the Trouble class destroyers. They're at the end. And they're part of the war build-up destroyers. They're not part of the interwar destroyers. So they are something we're mentioning, but they're not what we're going to get into in this video. We're going to look at all the things which come before them and why they come about. So this is very much on how the Royal Navy maintained its fighting edge from World War I and how it continued to build up its destroyer force. And it actually starts on that earlier than a fair number of the other large navies. They start on building large chunks of destroyers earlier, which does help them in part in World War II, but they still don't have enough. That's the thing. The Royal Navy very quickly realises, and other navies all sort of realise roughly about the same time, you're never going to have enough destroyers. No matter how many you built at the end of World War I, like the Americans with the Wicks and Clemens and classes, and as good as they were at the end of World War I, this capability of a destroyer decreases a lot quicker than the capability of a battleship. Why? Because of the size. You see, a larger asset is easier to upgrade, easier to keep current. Something which is built on a fighting edge, on a knife fighting edge, in many ways, is more difficult to keep current and to keep useful, unless you think about it. But let's start off with the Harwich Force. And there is something you have to realise about the Harwich Force from the get-go. It is the kind of force where you wouldn't believe it unless it actually happened, because you'd think it was fiction. Because you see in movies, you see these formations formed where they've got literally the best of everyone. They've got this person, they've got and they've got this team made up of these amazing people who are super skilled and super capable. And you're going, yeah, that's in most scenarios that's not going to be the case. You're not going to get the very best of the very best. You're going to get very good people. They might all be, let's say, US Navy SEALs or Royal Marines Special Boat Service. They're all going to be very good. But probably the literal tippy-top, absolute top 1% of those people are going to be spread around several different teams because you need them in different functions. They're not going to be grouped together. That is a movie scenario where they all get grouped together, because otherwise there's the whole thing of, we need those skills elsewhere. And these people are good enough. The Harwich Force, almost by accident more than effort, is not that scenario. The Harwich Force contains people who are names which are going to be remembered because they are the people who formed the Royal Navy in the 1920s and 30s. There is a Captain Roger Backhouse. in charge of HMS Conquest. There is a Captain Percy Rhodes in charge of Canterbury, and these are the light cruisers. Penelope under the command of Captain Herbert Lyons. Vindex, various things. Carrisford, of course, under the then Commodore Tyrwhitt, who of course goes on to become a full admiral of the fleet and various other things. This is a very, very important, very aggressive, very innately formed commando. And it gets worse once you go lower. The senior officers you find in the various destroyer groups and is just absurd for what they are. And there are two reasons you get this, I think. One is the experience of Harwich especially allows them to develop as officers, so they go on to these stellar careers, so it makes it look far like this was a far better force when they were putting it together than it was. But also, these are all young officers who are selected for their ability to operate independently and think independently. In other words, they are chosen because the Harwich Force needs this, because they're going to be doing a lot of night fighting, and at this point there's no night fighting doctrine. They're going to develop it from scratch for the Royal Navy. They're going to develop a lot of the combat techniques the Royal Navy will use in night fighting in the 1920s and 30s, and especially the idea of get close enough you can see the whites of their eyes. Fisher is, later Admiral Fisher is from the 30s is usually credited with that, but realistically he draws it from the experience which was generated by the Harwich Force, because that was basically their motto. At one point, I think it's Loda Simmons who put the quote that Tyrwhitt's idea was, if the paint was flecking off because of bashing into their hulls, then you were close enough to start engaging. Tyrwhitt liked to get really, really close. And this force is all about using a massively aggressive doctrine of warfare to dominate your opponent. Your opponent might have more numbers than you. You still attack. Your opponent might look like they're bigger ships than you. You still attack. Whatever you do, you attack. That's their policy. That's their belief. And that's how they achieve dominance. But that can sound rather one-dimensional when you start thinking about it, going, well, you're always attacking. Why? That sounds stupid. You're going to lose yourself, aren't you? Well, this is the point about harnessed aggression. This is the whole point about it and why they're trying to develop it. They want people to be thinking. They want them to be aggressively inclined. They want them to think about attacking the enemy, but they want them to think it through as how they're doing it. What is your methodology going to be? And it's the sort of training system which they develop, and based on the Harwich Force experience, it's basically, okay, we don't want scripted exercises. To an extent of, we don't want to have it scripted down to the level of what the ship maneuvers are going to be. We want it very much of, these are objectives, go do this. Let's see how you do this. And we're going to promote the officers who are doing it in the most aggressive manner possible, but are still succeeding. The ones who are aggressively seeking to dominate their opponent by basically going, you will, whatever you do, we will attack you, so you will constantly think that you are going to be attacked. But also will do it in such a way that it keeps the enemy thinking, oh, what the frig are they going to do next? And this is the reality. It's, you get this discussion, and I'm going to quickly grab Action This Day from Philip Vian, give you an example of it. You have to start rewarding this sort of aggression. Now, Philip Vian is well known for being a pretty aggressive Royal Navy officer. And yes, I've done videos on him. Pretty aggressive is putting it in mild terms. In 1932, I joined Active, which was a divisional leader in the 3rd Destroyer Flotilla in the Mediterranean. It was then unusual for a specialist officer, such as I was, to be appointed to lead a destroyer division. A post which, very naturally, the regular destroyer hands regarded as entirely within their own orbit. The division watched and waited, and not for long. Active going astern, as was necessary, alongside a depot ship in Lazaranto Creek, Malta, carried away an overhanging part of the superstructure, and had to return to dockyard. In my report, there being nothing else to say, the accident was attributed to pure mishandling. I was told to be more careful in future, but the Commander-in-Chief added a paragraph in the sense that he had liked the manner of the confession. This was in character, for the William Wordsworth of Fisher, the great Agrippa, a veritable colossus, towered over our fortunes in Mediterranean. An inspiring commander, with a tactical flair which no peacetime exercise could conceal. He was a font of magnanimity and of encouragement to aspiring young officers, nearly of all whom, even in so great a fleet, he seemed to know personally. On my being promoted captain in 1934, Admiral Fisher asked me to dine, sitting beside him. He wished me good luck with the port and added, "You'll be in my chair one day." For once he was wrong. During my commission in the active, there came a day when word was received that Rear Admiral Andrew Cunningham had been appointed to and was shortly to assume command of the Mediterranean destroyer flotillas. The old hands, those who, like himself, had spent years in destroyers, prepared us for tears and blood and sweat. On the first meeting him, I began to doubt. His smile was too disarming. In the event, there was sweat enough, but few tears and no blood. There was also certain relentlessness in pursuit of excellence, mostly at a higher level than one thought decently attainable. Now, the point here is this. That's the beginning of his book. The long book comes after. He crashes a destroyer. When you actually read the full maneuver, he's coming in too fast. He's been trying to beat people. It was a bit of a race. And he does it again. Later on, another destroyer. And it's fine. We'll get it fixed. There's high standards. We're expecting excellence. We're expecting you to achieve excellence. But what is that excellence? Is that excellence paperwork? We want you to be honest in your paperwork. You want to fill it out, but it's not what we're caring about. Is it excellence in terms of never making a mistake? Nope. No. That's not going to preserve the aggression. That's going to produce a generation of officers who are going to be scared of their own shadows. You want officers who are going to be aggressive, who are going to dominate the enemy. You can't afford them being scared of making a mistake. It's excellence in terms of your ability to adapt to situations, to dominate your opponent, to objectively push out. And one of the things that is true about Vian's career basically the whole way through is he's very good at that. He's very good at looking at a situation, assessing it, and coming up with a way to dominate the situation and thereby dominate his opponent. And this is something you have going on throughout this period. Now, most of the destroyers you're going to be dealing with this period for the Royal Navy are the late World War I destroyers. And again, these are more of a topic for the World War I video. But the R's, built 1916 to 1917, there's 62 of them. They're good boats. They're good ships. They're not always the best, but they are good ships, reliable ships. The only real difference between them and these other destroyers is that, well, the R's have 3 funnels, 3 stacks. And they've gone with this sort of arrangement into having their boilers in sort of series and having sort of... is again another estimate to try and get them faster. They're aiming for 36 knots. They're trying to make them as efficient as possible. And these are 1,000 tons, less than 1,000 tons in standard. They're 991 tons in standard. Roughly 1,000 tons, lower 1,000 to 1,100 tons, fully loaded. There are some Thornycroft ones, and again, there are some variations in these designs. One of the things you find in the Royal Navy is there are variations between the ones which are built to the standard description, the ones which might be built by Thornycroft, the ones which might be built by Yarrow. And it's really weird because normally I would be talking about the Royal Navy and standardization. It's obsession with standardization, making sure they're exactly the same. But to be honest, the Royal Navy is actually purposely trying to pursue this as an idea of trying to further develop the destroyers. For the Royal Navy, World War I represents a changing point. You have, well, the V&W class is a classic example of this again. They actually start prior. They start prior to the Royal Navy circling on the R class, but they get developed through multiple generations and multiple variations along the time, and different ideas come through, and the Royal Navy is almost pushing still to develop its destroyer force. It's almost like they're using World War I and mass destroyer building as an exercise in let's refine and develop our techniques and test out a load of ideas, which is really stupid under most circumstances. But they're being quite clever in how they're going about it, because they're standardizing some of their form, they're standardizing their armament. What they're letting is hull design be variated. And in many ways, the thing you can possibly muck around most is hull design. And they're buying them in enough numbers, it isn't going to matter. You're not going to have one ship or something doing something, or 2 ships. You know, if you consider the R class, to start off with, you know, the Royal Navy Admiralty Standard R, they order the most of those. There's 2 ordered in May 1915 in the 5th War Programme, 17 ordered in the 6th War Programme, 8 ordered in the 7th War Programme, and 12 ordered in the 8th War Programme, March 1916. So, they have got a wonderful total of 39 of those out of 67. 62, I mean, sorry. There are 2 classes of 67 here, and I got confused for a second. Both the S-Class and the V&Ws are 67s, the Rs are 62. And then you have Admiralty modified R design. They built 11 of those. There are some modifications the Royal Navy like to put into their design, the Admiralty. And then Thornycroft, they produce 5 to their own design, to their own slightly variated design. Yarrow produced 7 to their variated designs. So that gives them a good idea to test out what are the Yarrow ideas, what are the Thornycroft ideas. And it carries on. With the S-Class, you have a similar scenario going on. Now, the S-Class are cute boats. They really are cute ships. I know I keep calling them boats and ships and I keep differentiating around, but that's because at the time, honestly, some of the people, when they talk about them, will refer to them more as a boat than a ship because of their size and because they come from the torpedo boats and then they were torpedo boat destroyers. And there's a real lexicon change. Slowly, it becomes recognised as destroyers are ships in this period. So part of me is me trying to put that in. As part of me, just my own notes are I sometimes have boat/ship because of the way people are referring to them at the time. So I do apologise for that if it's getting a bit weird and confusing, but it's because of, at the time, it was a bit confusing. It was very much, there was a thing of almost that the destroyer leaders were ships and the destroyers themselves were boats at one point. They were trying to implement that as an idea. It was an idea for like a month, I think, in 1914, late 1914. I think it's about October time 1914. They had that idea. And it still is hanging around a bit into 1918. They're still working this through because these are quite so small compared to their other counterparts. And the officers commanding them are quite so junior compared to their other counterparts. You could get a destroyer commanded by a lieutenant. You should be a lieutenant commander, but could get a destroyer commanded by a lieutenant. But they are powerful assets. They are very powerful assets. The S-Class was, said again, another one of variations. Again, though, they are capable of 36 knots. Slightly shorter range than their R-Class counterparts. The R-Class, they could do 3,400 nautical miles at 15 knots. The S-Class, 2,700 nautical miles at 15 knots. It's a bit of a difference going on there. A bit of a difference. There's also a variation of torpedoes going on and developments of the torpedoes, but they're working on them. And then you get to the V&W class. And the V&W class are this really important class for the Royal Navy in terms of developing the future destroyers. And I've also added in the Thornycroft type destroyer leaders up here because they are also a point of... The Royal Navy at this point was trying to go, okay, we're building a destroyer leader. What is our destroyer leader going to look like? What are our large destroyers going to look like? And the V&W class destroyers are interesting because they have some leaders built into them, they have some regular class vessels built into them, and they plan to build 107 of these ships. They delivered 67. And by this point they are called ships. There it is confirmed. The Royal Navy had planned 69 of the S-Class. They built 67. They had planned 62 of the R-Class. They built all 62. The Admiralty M-Class, which came even before that, the Royal Navy planned a lot. It's easy to say. The Royal Navy planned a lot. They built 85. The Royal Navy's World War I destroyer program is just print. We talk about World War II and the Americans, etc., but the Royal Navy does exactly the same in World War I. They're basically going, we want a destroyer, and people go, how many? They go, we want destroyer. How many? We want destroyer. Okay. That does give them, though, a very interesting basis to work from when they're working with it. And as I said, this explains partially why the V&W are the mix of leaders and various things they are, because the Royal Navy is building upon the experience they've already developed. There is a huge variance across the V&W class in some regards in terms of their outfitting of their engines and their shaping and form. They're all V&W class destroyers. Don't get me wrong, they're all, you put them together, you know exactly what class you're dealing with. But there's still a variance going on. And they are useful ships. They provide, in many ways, the basis of the Royal Navy's development for the interwar years. But what they're working from with these is a rather enhanced development program based on experience. They started off with the early experience of the Harwich Force, but also the early battles. And they've been synthesizing that data, and it's been coming in. And there's a reason a lot of these ships programs are starting in 1916. A lot of them are started even before Jutland. They're using the experience from Dogger Bank, they're using the experience of various convoy operations, of various things they've been doing with destroyers to go, okay, so our design up until now has been good. Okay. We have a nice design. It's not what we need, though. It was fine under pre-war doctrine, but the doctrine now isn't working. And we've got to make ships which are going to fit with the doctrine that we are now using, and that doctrine is based upon having crew who are very, very aggressive. And how are they going to use that? How do we need the ships to be that aggressive? And one of the things they start working on is going, okay, the torpedoes are going to matter for this. We're going to need to hit hard with our torpedo strength, and this is one of the reasons why they jump from 18 to 21 inches when they do, when they start pushing those in. But also why the gun sizes start to go up. Again, it's to try and fit in with the aggressive nature of your crews and how they're applying the doctrine. And this leads to building in that aggression longer term. Because you're coming out of World War I, and the Royal Navy has built the ships, they've got the crews, they've got the aggression, they've got everything they want, and now they're scared of losing it. And I gave you the example of Vian, I read that from Action this day, but these are the officers they picked to stop them losing it. Now, a really good example of this is Albert Addison, who basically returns from 2 years as Rear Admiral commanding His Majesty's Australian Fleet to become the first Rear Admiral destroyers for the Mediterranean Fleet. And at the same time, he is being contrasted with George Baird, who is the Rear Admiral destroyers for the Atlantic Fleet at the time. Turns into the home fleet in 1932-ish, and then there's all sorts of fun as it carries on, and then it's different command structure. But I'm talking about the late 1920s to early 1930s period, and I've continued on the Mediterranean fleet because it's useful to think about the officers who come next for them. But there's a great quote on the Dreadnought project, which Simon Harley has added some notes onto, and I've got a link there and to that, and I do recommend you go look at the Dreadnought project about George Baird, because it goes, speaking to Captain Herbert Richmond, who was a quite good historian in 1917, Baird apparently said to Jutland, to wait all that time and then turn away from them instead of towards them was sickening. They gave us our chance and we weren't allowed to take it. Except this conversation took place, this writer has been unable to find among the Jutland papers any mentions of Captain Baird hauling Ajax out of line after the Germans, or him signalling his immediate superior in the battle line, Vice Admiral Jerram, suggesting that he do the same. Just because a junior officer is willing to take the risk to risk his ship doesn't mean that it's necessary or even advisable. Now that's the point. There's a thing of, again, we're talking about is calculated aggression. They want the level of aggression which Baird is talking about to be inoculated of turning towards the enemy into the junior ranks. And again, when you've got Albert Addison, former Rear Admiral commanding His Majesty's Australian Fleet, coming there, again, coming from a fairly aggressive force, a force which has been developing itself as a dominating force to be the first Rear Admiral destroyers for Mediterranean, they're looking for someone who's going to be giving them the thinking of to be aggressive. But you also want them to exercise thought. You don't want them going, you know what, I'm going to turn my ship straight into the enemy and get myself killed. No, I want to attack the enemy, but I want to do it in a way which is going to give me an advantage. The example I give for that is later on, and we're talking about the G class in a bit in this video, Glowworm, and how she attacks Hipper. Think of how long she survives, how much she manages to press the attack home before she's put down. There is aggression going on there, but there's not a lack of thought behind it. There is thoughtful aggression. There is a plan. There is an idea. There is something they are trying to do. They are not just hurling themselves at the enemy. And that is the thing. You want people who are prepared to hurl themselves at the enemy, but who are going to think about how best to do it to achieve the maximum impact. You don't want people who are just going to go, enemy, charge! You want to go, people are going to go, enemy. Their weakness is that size. Charge! You want them to think before they act. You want them to have the desire to act, but you want them to think about it before they act. You need people who are going to do that step of desire, thought, and act, and need to do all three. And again, you look at the officers they're putting in: Hugh Tweedy, Michael Hodges, Arthur Waisel, Colin McLean, Wayne Edgerton, Robin Dalgleish, Edward Osborne. All these are senior officers who go on to doing quite important things in the Royal Navy and are known for being quite aggressive in their naval operations. Mediterranean Fleet, which was always, remember, the fleet which was going to first react to going to the Far East, is even more like that, because you start going, well, Albert Anderson, then it's Herbert Mead, Arthur Dutton, Charles Forbes, Frank Rose, Andrew Cunningham, James Somerville, John Tovey. Would help if I could smell James. If we leave that to one side. Sorry, I just noticed there was an extra E, and I do not know how it had managed to make it all the way through Microsoft spell checking, everything spell checking, and, had managed to not work out that James had an extra E. But all these things going through, these are aggressive officers, but aggressive officers who think. And that's as important for the Royal Navy as it is the actual doctrine or the actual ships. You have to have all three components to have effective destroyers, and that's what the Royal Navy in the interwar years is especially building towards. You need to have the ships, which allow them to be aggressive. You need to have the doctrine, which gives them a basis for their aggression, but gives them a structured approach to how to think about how to best apply their aggression. You need to have officers who are aggressive. You can't get by with just one of three, and you can't get by without one of those three. You need everything. And that's a challenge. That is a challenge. But they've done all the building of the NW class, but still that's not enough. They need to work out something more. So they start off with HMS Ambuscade. And Ambuscade is a great one-off destroyer. She really is. She's a one-off destroyer that the Royal Navy is sort of looking at going, how's this going to work? What's this going to give us? What's this going to work through? They've done the Thornycroft destroyer leaders, but with Ambuscade's case, that basically it's the Royal Navy going, we need some ideas here. And it's not a surprise to me that these ships are being ordered after a year of thought and just before Albert Addison comes into the Mediterranean, and when you've had this build-up going through the Atlantic Fleet. You've had all this work going on, all this theory going on, these ideas, and they've had the treaties in place for a couple of years. Remember, the Washington Naval Treaty really doesn't touch destroyers at all. They're sub 10,000 tons, so you can build what you want. Whatever you want. So the Royal Navy started off by going, okay, what are these ships going to look like? What are they going to be for? How are they going to be put together? And Ambuscade and Amazon are a really good example of this, because they're built, around 6 21-inch torpedo tubes. They're built around 4 4.7-inch guns. In mounts which are, well, in the theoretically dual purpose. Theoretically, they are dual purpose, able to AA and anti-surface. And they've also got pom-poms. In the case of Ambuscade, Amazon I'll be talking about in a bit, she's built by Yarrow. Again, go back and you find Yarrow have built a lot of destroyers for Royal Navy by this point. Amazon is built by Thornycroft. She's got a top speed of 37 knots. She's able to do 3,310 nautical miles at 15 knots. She is ordered in June 1924. She's laid down in December 1924. She's launched in January 1926, and she's commissioned in April 1927. She is quite a slow build by destroyer standards. But also, they do a lot of testing. They're doing a lot of theory work on her. She is a destroyer which they're looking at going, what can we get from you? What can we learn from you? What can we understand from you? And when you combine that with the officers coming in and the officers they're pushing through from the top and how they're, using these officers to inspire the ones coming in from the bottom, and you've got people like Vian, etc., coming in at various levels at the bottom, you have a circumstance going on where the Royal Navy is managing to avoid, I would say, a loss of institutional memory. Now, we tend to talk as historians about two forms of memory. Sometimes we go three. Sometimes we talk about personal memory, but realistically, that's more into relation of sources. We'll talk about that. We're talking about organizations, we're talking about nations, we're talking about cultural memory and institutional memory. Cultural memory are things which are handed down as cultural myths and ideas throughout the centuries, stories that will pass on, that are supposed to teach people tales of how you approach things, especially when you've got a heroic tale, etc., all these things. Well, for Britain at this point, the Harwich Force is a cultural memory. The Royal Navy, though, is trying to make it an institutional memory. And try and do that by managing to inoculate a lot of officers in the memory of the Harwich Force. They even have quite a lot of destroyers hang out at Harwich and still, and at various points at this point. Two, as part of it, it's part of our normal basing, obviously, but the fact that they like to turn as many through there as often as they do does suggest that they are doing a little bit more than just that. And again, this is about building up the destroyer force as an elite. Interesting discussion when you're reading The Victory at Sea, which is Admiral Sims' book, the American, who was in charge of the American fleet deployments in World War I over here, and his talk with Admiral Bailey. And Sims really likes the way Bailey approaches his destroyermen, and especially his approach to his American destroyermen, how they are his. It's very much a part of how you establish an elite force. Again, we give an example of Vian earlier, when he's talking about Fisher, how the Agrippa, that was Fisher's nickname in the fleet, how he approached dealing with problems. He has set a benchmark. He is expecting aggression. He is expecting thinking. He's expecting honesty of communication. If you achieve those things, if something happens and goes wrong, you're not going to have any problems in your career because they'll have to go through him. Just as with the American sailors in Cork, if there was in Queenstown, when there was issues in Cork, as far as Admiral Bailey was concerned, if you have trouble with them, you have to go through him because they're his sailors. This is important. That had been very much Turret's approach to the Harwich Force. This is one of the things that starts to appear throughout the Royal Navy, and it's very important to making these destroyers. And one of the reasons why you have the Rear Admiral destroyers in the first place is so that in each fleet, the destroyers feel like they have a boss who ranks in with the cruiser officers, who ranks in with the senior fleet officers, and if you have a problem with the destroyers, you don't start charging down at them and attacking them. No, you go to their boss. And their boss gets to decide if it's a problem or not. So you don't get a scenario of, I'm in charge of a cruiser, you're a destroyer, you're junior me, you are at fault. No, because you can say that all you want, but there's a Rear Admiral destroyers who will come and chat to you and go, well, so you're saying you're right because you have more gold braid than him. Which one of us has more gold braid? Might doesn't make right, and neither does gold braid. Let's look at the situation. And allows them to grow. And that helps when you have vessels like Amazon. Now, I would always say Ambuscade is a very good example of what the Royal Navy might have gone down the route of. Amazon is a very good example of what they end up going down the route of. Because if you notice, when you look at this vessel, yes, it's got 2 stacks, and it looks kind of like the World War II form of the Royal Navy destroyers. But then you look at Amazon and you're going, that's really like Royal Navy destroyers. Angles of the bow, angles of the lines, the way the decks are cut down, etc. This looks very, very like a Royal Navy destroyer in World War II. And it very much is. It has the new destroyer director control tower and various other things fitted to it that are going to be fitted to the C and the C class and other classes of vessel of Royal Navy destroyers. Basically, I think it's fitted to every class of Royal Navy destroyer from the C to the U's. We'll talk about the C's in a bit. And Amazon only reaches 34.5 knots in her initial trials, so they do some modifications to her. And then she gets to 37.5 knots. They like that. This is one of the things. The Royal Navy loves this ship because A, they're able to fix it and upgrade it to speed they want very reasonably in the trials, but also they are able to use it as the basis of design. And right up until you get to the Tribal class, this is the basis. All the next destroyers that come out from the Royal Navy, they are basically based from HMS Amazon. The options were going to be Amazon and Ambuscade. Ambuscade was very good, but it's Amazon they have worked from because she's just that bit better. And the really advantageous thing she has is that she's not only easily recognizable and easily spotted, but her internal organization makes maintenance and crew life a lot easier. I would argue that Ambuscade was still based on the idea of destroyers being barely evolved torpedo boats in some ways. She still has very tight confined spaces which are going to make long range deployments, especially to Far East, etc., hot, sweaty and difficult. It's going to make maintenance more difficult. It makes the vessel actually slightly more survivable, but it makes it more difficult to maintain and look after. Amazon is just that bit better in all those fronts. She's got slightly larger spaces. She's got slightly easier organisation. It's easier to maintain. You want to do the same job on Amazon as Ambuscade, it will take a little bit less or require less people. And why is that? Because here's the dirty little secret of ship maintenance, and it's a dirty little secret that's often forgotten. If it's easy to access somewhere, something can be done by less people. If you've got a maintenance position which can be easily walked up to and inspected visually and then walked away from, because it's in a space where things aren't likely to fall into it, so it doesn't need as much covering, or perhaps any covering, then one person wandering around does the maintenance and is spotting things and keeping a track on stuff, and then if people actually need to do work, you call in more people. If, however, it's a position which requires you to be perched over the engine and you have to pull up a cover and all these things, suddenly you need 2 people to go and do that regular check. And if you have to do that check, let's say when you're cruising at 20 knots, you have to do that check every 3 hours, that means you have to have 2 people who are going to spend every 3 hours about 20-30 minutes doing that check, because it's going to be the time to get into position, get up, get everything settled, get the cover up, do the check, maybe add in oil, maybe, or lubrication, or whatever you need to do, check the systems, take down, mark it up, put in notifications if there is something which you're not quite sure about. Those, it looks like it might be bad, but it's not requiring any help in this moment, but it might require later, so you want to put a note of that. All these things, then carry on. That takes a lot longer than one person. That requires more people. So if you make things bigger and easier to access in terms of the spacing, internal to the ship, you actually can end up reducing your crew requirement. Because you don't need to have more people, as many people on a standard watch. Let's say your watch number you need for engine room, per engine room, and let's say you've got 2 engine rooms and you've got 2 boiler rooms, and you go from needing 8 people on duty to 6. Well, if you're running a free watch system and you've got 4 rooms, you go from needing 96 crew for it, because it's 3 times 32, free watch system, to 72. It's a drop of 24 personnel. 25% reduction in people. And the other thing is that this can be different as you go from ships. This can be expressed in different ways, because that might mean you have extra people for other things. This might mean you have fewer overall people. In the case of Ambuscade and Amazon, they both have roughly the same amount of crew, 138. What it meant was that Amazon was, as a rule, usually spending less time having maintenance than Ambuscade, which meant she was more available. She had the same number of crew. They were able to achieve and do far greater maintenance on her, which meant she had to spend less time in dry docks on long deployments. That was useful. That was felt to be useful. Didn't continue for all her life, because she did have, because one of the things that tends to happen with ships is the more they can be used, the more they are used, the more they are used, the more other things start to wear on them. But she was a good ship. She was a good ship. And that leads us to Shameless Book Plug time. Now, it's rare I do a Shameless Book Plug with the book I'm shamelessly plugging. There are more books coming soon. They're currently being held up by my own obsessive editing, because they are self-published on Kindle. They're going to be Kindle Direct Publishing, and you are going to be able to get physical copies of them. Also, this in my hands might mean that I have finally managed to not only get the box, the correct box, which actually had them in and had the prizes in, but actually the box actually be able to get it out and open up, and so I've got the books for the prizes, so I'll be able to sort out the prizes finally. The writing competition. So I'll be able to run another writing competition soon, which would be nice for the Air Destroyer. It's got things like this, the plans of the Daring class in it, and all sorts of other gorgeous stuff in there. It really has. It's quite cool, you know. I managed to find all sorts of plans doing the archives at Trawl and pictures. Drac really was really helpful to pictures, but also so was Maritime Quest and a few others putting it together. And yeah. National Maritime Museum were also quite gorgeous in terms of some of the designs they produced for Dainty, etc. It was really a lovely experience putting this all together and getting this all. And yeah, this is a book on Tribal class destroyers, but the thing is, realistically, if I'm honest, once I've got the 45,000 word book series sort of going on, the what are basically I'm calling the introductions to, or possibly the, quick guides to. I'm not sure what I'm going to go with as a phrasing for those. One of the things I'm going to try and work on is the earlier destroyers, and some of the destroyer classes I'm going to be covering, especially from now in this video, in terms of their history, because they often get forgotten, but they're quite important and quite useful. And that's one of the things that the Royal Navy managed to do a lot more iterative construction development of its destroyers than other nations do, and that's why I really enjoy this period, because it's all carrying on. And realistically, most people, not even the government or the Treasury, are taking any notice of what the Royal Navy's doing to money. They're just going, oh, they're ordering some destroyers. The Royal Navy's going, yes, we're ordering some destroyers, and they are small, because we build small destroyers. And as you're going to notice, when we start going through the slides of the destroyers, small is relative. Small is relative, and what's happening? Well, things change. They do change. Just you do some work on it, and you get some ideas about how you're going to do the things, and you start changing some things. That's what happens. Now, I've kept mentioning doctrine, but I haven't gone into detail just yet, and that's because I wanted to wait till we got to the exercises, because the exercises are where the Royal Navy goes. So this is our idea. We've done nice theoretical work. We've done a tabletop exercise, or actually, and this is something I want to someday to get. There's a beautiful floor in Greenwich, in the Old Naval College, and it's where they did a lot of their exercises. It's literally, the floor has been marbled out to make grid squares for operations. It's really quite cool. I've seen it done a couple of times by historians at conferences. They've set it up as a wargaming scenario, and I'm never quite sure whether it was designed for wargaming or whether wargaming was designed around it, but it seems to fit it perfectly. We'll see. It's one of those things of history where there are lots of different theories going on about it. But the thing is, you have the exercises, you have night fighting rules, you have the various war manual, and all stuff coming together, especially in the 1920s, to give us an earlier view. There's later ones produced in the 1930s, but in the 1920s, the Naval War Manual is really quite cool because it defines destroyers. And by defining them, it gives us something, sort of a benchmark to sort of work through. They're great speed on a small displacement, with the torpedo as their chief weapon and a gun armament effective against their own kind, mark the destroyer type. The strategical function, and I do love the strategical, I do like that phrase, not strategical function of destroyer. Strategical function of destroyer may include independent operations against the enemy, exercise of control, and minesweeping. Exercise of control. Exercise of control of the sea. That's an important part of Royal Navy doctrine. Exercising control of the sea. That's where the dominance comes in. That's where we need to be the dominant power. We need to set the tone. We need to set the pace of operations. If we're going to have a chance of winning wars, we need to be setting the pace of the operations. Even if we are one of the largest, or actually the largest navy in the world at this point. And please note, the reason I'm saying the largest navy at this point is because whilst on paper the Royal Navy and the US Navy are supposed to be the same size, as I've said many times before, on paper they're supposed to be the same size. You get the money out of Congress to make the US Navy the same size as the Royal Navy, and the US Navy will be very happy. But at this point, whilst on paper they are supposed to be the same size, Congress has successfully managed to salt that. So the Royal Navy is the largest navy in the world at this point. And even then, they are sitting there going, right, we need to achieve dominance. Because whilst we're the largest navy in the world, we have to deal with operations around the world to defend the empire. We have to deal with operations which are going to encompass potentially the world. We could be dealing with multiple theatres. So therefore, there is quite a high likelihood that in a local scenario, local theatre, let's say the Far East, especially for a certain amount of time, we could be a smaller power. So we need our smaller forces in an area to achieve a level of psychological dominance over their opponent, which is where exercising of control comes in. We have to show we control the sea, and we have to use it. The tactical function of destroyer. The primary tactical function of destroyer is torpedo attack on enemy ships. Other tactical functions of destroyers include attack upon submarines, destruction of disabled ships, and the provision of tactical security for units of the fleet. And tactical security comes in a lot. That is destruction of torpedo boats, destruction of other destroyers, and destruction of aircraft. That is what tactical security comprises. And that's all comes from ADM 18666. So if you go to the UK National Archives, you can get out the Naval War Manual. You can read it all through. And then I have various things highlighted from the reports from the exercise in 1927, which come after. One point is the 1927, the night fighting. And that's night fighting continued. But, the following points have arisen in exercises. A searchlight beam shown by the rear ship of line on a forward-bearing hides the remaining ships from any destroyers which may be attacking on that side. They're working this out. It's not. You have to remember, the Royal Navy, one of the advantages of investing in night fighting like they're doing, is they not only get their night fighting skills, they also get the skills about how to defend against night attack, and they're doing this constantly practicing. Pretty much every exercise in the 1920s and 1930s includes a night fighting component. It's something the Royal Navy's prepared to risk ships in. They have destroyers which get bashed up in on a semi-regular basis. They are prepared to risk personnel in, night flying, etc. One of the things about night flying and night training for pilots is that the leading cause of death in several years for naval aviators is carrying out operations at night, because it is that high risk. And so you have to be really willing to invest in these things and willing to sacrifice to really get them to grow. Point 2, on one occasion, the battle fleet was observed silhouetted against its own searchlight beams at a distance of 8 to 10 miles, and an accurate estimate was made of its course by the striking force, and that striking force was destroyers. So this is one of the reasons why, again, the Royal Navy starts to not like searchlights, because they start to realise they're destroyers. They like to use it so other people's destroyers. The silhouetting effect is lost when a beam is exposed towards, not necessarily directly at, the observer. There have been several cases of excessive use of searchlights by battleships, resulting in the position of other columns being disclosed through silhouetting effect. In one instance, range-finding observations of battleship searchlights at 9 to 10 miles by striking force proved of value in fixing the enemy's position, which resulted in, well, the destroyers getting into the kill position. And there are a fair number of exercises where you will see little sort of notations like this. I've used the one from NNH, but there are other options where they basically show the track marks of what other ships will do in this scenario. And I'll have, well, despite the forces being the red and the blue forces, and sometimes did use blue ink to mark out the blue forces, they tend to, you find most documents these days have black ink in them, and in some cases that's because they use black ink. In some cases it's a slightly different shade. My strong suspicion is that the blue ink has turned to black over time. It was not necessarily the best public quality ink. I might be wrong on that. I have talked with various paper analysts over the time on the exercise and documents, and they're going, it can happen, but it shouldn't happen. But there again, some of these were written up in a saltwater environment, which apparently can have that effect. And then they've been stored in various cases, usually in Admiralty archives, before eventually they went to the National Archives. So things could have happened, but there's also a possibility that they were using a different shade of black ink. But then again, they use blue in some cases. So it's just another case of the Royal Navy probably doing something which is just to mess with my head as a historian. That's what I think. But the exercises keep coming through for the Royal Navy as these demonstrations of you need to delegate authority down. You need to give real authority to your destroyer officers. And the way you give destroyer officers, relatively junior officers, authority in something like the Royal Navy, in a scenario, and that gives them confidence to be able to act independently. And one of the reasons why you do have these Rear Admiral destroyers and Mediterranean and all these things is they have to know the bounds they're operating in. I know I keep emphasizing this, but it's an important point. And they have to know who is going to be in their corner if they muck up. They have to have that confidence. And it's the same in sort of every organization, if you think about it. If you think about your own experiences in organizations when you work out, if you've got a senior boss who you know is going to look first at what you were trying to do and give you a fair chance to explain your ideas, and then will decide whether you're wrong or right, rather than a boss who's mainly going to go, okay, this is mucked up, you're at fault, you're in trouble, you're out of here. Which is the organization you're going to work harder in, but also you're going to develop more in. And developing skills is all what the Royal Navy is about, because the Royal Navy at this point realizes that they got very lucky in Model 1 and the Harwich Force, because they had turrets and they had these people. They had had a chance to develop under that system, but it was far rarer. The Royal Navy now needed to breed a force, destroyer force, which believed it was universally elite and was going to produce enough of these leaders to support a whole wide force. So they would have every flotilla led by a turret-style person. And they wouldn't be exactly the same as him. They wouldn't be exactly as aggressive and but they wanted someone who's going to use thinking aggression. Or thoughtful aggression. Put it the phrase you prefer. And to do that, they needed a system which was going to grow those leaders. So first of all, they had to make sure they were picking the leaders above who were going to allow those leaders to grow. Then they had to give them the opportunities, the exercises, the general activity to demonstrate those skills. And then when they had to reward them and put them into positions where they could encourage others, so you could push this down. You could grow this level of independent operational capability. And that takes me back to this. Exercise of control. Exercise of control may include independent operations against the enemy. Exercise of control. That's really interesting, having that in 1926, because if you think about the Royal Navy's fleet operations and doctrine in World War One, and then how it evolves in World War Two, in World War One, the Harwich Force and destroyers behaving as independently is kind of weird in 1914. It's weird in 1915. It's not so weird by the end of the war, but by this period, they are now including in doctrine as a core point that destroyers have to be able to operate independently. And this is really pushing the growth in size of the ships. When you're thinking about a fleet unit, you can make it as small as you like, because there's always something big to back it up. There's always something bigger there to act as sort of the backstop and go for the destroyers to hide by. This means the destroyers are very close to torpedo boats. But as time goes on, and as you develop it, we want something bigger. So this is where it comes interesting, because we've now got the A and B and the C and Ds. And if we consider, compared to the ships we were talking about, Amazon and Ambuscade, Ambuscade's tonnage, standard tonnage, is about a couple of 100 tons less than them. They're not that different from Amazon's. They're still slightly small. And when we start to look further on, we sort of go, okay, the C's and D's, they're getting more still. What's really interesting, though, is their deep load and how that's increasing. Now, I would say when it comes to standard displacement, and I've done a video about Washington treaties recently, how you cheat the Washington Treaty, and how there was cheating going on, I would say standard displacement is a figure I place very little faith in. Okay, it's close to a real figure, but I would trust it about as far as I could throw it, because it's often a very theoretical figure. And I know from the research I did in this book, and there is a table in this book which has it, and so then go through what was their official treaty standard displacement, what was their actual standard displacement according to yards which built them. Those two figures are rarely the same. Admittedly, by the time the tribals are really entering service in numbers, the treaties has reached the point of we are ignoring it. It's now no longer functioning. It's ignored completely. But they did start out in the treaty period, and they are supposed to be treaty compliant at 1,850 tons standard displacement. The fact that they're not. So yeah, these ships, they're growing up. Now, the other interesting thing about them is if we consider Amazon Ambuscade, they have triple launchers for their torpedoes. They are triples. These are quads. They're carrying quad torpedo launchers. They've still got their 4.7-inch guns. They still have pom-poms, but they now have 8 21-inch torpedo tubes in two quad launchers. Officially, they don't carry reloads. Again, officially, Royal Navy destroyers do not carry reloads. Unofficially, they almost all seem to have positions which are designed for torpedoes to be tied down and low down. In World War II, there are positions referred to as torpedo standing points. And there are positions where if you talk to the sailors who are involved on those ships, they will tell you they had a spare or a couple of spare torpedoes tucked away. They won't be carrying a full reload set. I don't think any of them are doing that. But again, their official pre-war loadout doesn't include any torpedo standing points. Their wartime loadout, and especially once you start going through some of their operations and they're listing, oh, we fired this many torpedoes then we fired this many torpedoes, then we fired this many torpedoes. So they're going, okay, you must have had some reloads. Classic example I use is one of the Royal Navy Trouble class destroyers in a battle fires 8 torpedoes. It launches a salvo of 3, then it launches another salvo of 3, and then it launches a salvo of 2. It has a single quintuple launcher and theoretically doesn't carry any reloads. But you go through that document and you'll find it's saying it fired 3, then it fired 3 more, then it fired 2. That suggests to me there's at least 3 torpedoes, plus there's a gap between the firing, which again suggests there's some sort of loading. I think only 1 was loaded. I think they fired 3, had 2 remaining, added 1 more in, fired it, and then they loaded 2 more. The largest gap is between the last 2 salvos. But again, this doesn't surprise me for ships, because again, if we go back to this document and we think about these ships and we think about what the Royal Navy is talking about in this period when they're designing these ships, the Royal Navy is saying that the primary weapon of a destroyer, the primary tactical function of the destroyer, is torpedo attack on enemy ships. Now, standard displacement rules to fit according to them, theoretically you'd have to include any reloads in that standard displacement. Remember the phrase though is intention. So I don't intend to carry any spare torpedoes, but in wartime I have spaces, I have options, I have crew who are good with block and tackle. Whereas the Japanese go for slightly more interesting takes in terms of what they're including and not including in their standard displacement, and actually proper reloaders. Honestly, I prefer the Japanese system. It's less likely to cause trouble to their crew, but it also does mean that you are honestly having to adjust weights elsewhere, and that makes it more difficult in other ways. Realistically, the destroyers are being kept too light for what they need to do. And then that takes us to the E and the F and the G and H. And again, you'll notice that these vessels are expanding in size. These previous ones, 1,300 tons. A little bit heavier, nearly just under 1,400 tons. Standard displacement, going up to, over 1,900 tons for deep load. They are a bit bigger than Amazon, but not massively bigger. These, well, they're well over 1,400 tons in the case of the E and Fs. The Hs try to drop down again, but then look at their fully loaded deep load displacement, and the leader's variations, standard displacement, etc. These ships are getting quite big, fully loaded. And again, I would more trust the deep load, full load displacement than I would the standard displacement as a figure. I'm not sure I would trust it completely anyway, but we'll leave that to one side. Again, a lot of these figures are their peacetime figures and are figures that they are providing to organizations which are going to disseminate them, either officially through official channels for the treaty powers, or publicly in things like Janes and Brassies that are going to be bought by members of the public and are basic starting points for intelligence. And if you think today, do we put all our information out in public, or do we provide safer public consumption figures, which are sort of basic stats on these things, so people have an idea about how capable equipment is, but not a full idea of it. And it's the same in the 1920s and 30s. No one is going, you know what, we're going to show you everything and we're going to publish it and completely be open source. I was having a conversation with someone the other day who was going, no, it was all open source, it all had to be by treaty, those were the rules. And I went, we have just had a discussion where we have talked about how they are already flouting the standard displacement rules and are going through these things, and you've agreed with me. And then you think that the figures, if they're already flouting the standard displacement figures, you think that any of the figures they're providing for public information are 100% correct? They're guideline figures, they're average figures, they're intended figures. They might not be the real figure. But what we do get the idea is, generally the classes are getting bigger. Now, with the H's, considering that some of them, the Havants, are being bought by the Brazilians, we have an interesting sort of idea for them. and their capabilities, but again, they are vessels produced far enough along in the war when they're finally finished that they can be more honest, or less honest depending on your perspective, and get away with it. Also, I did just notice that I had written depth load rather than deep load. I'm sorry, Johnny Depp, no. It was not 1,884 to 1,890 depths loaded into the into the destroyer as a displacement. That'd be an interesting figure of displacement. We'll leave that to one side. Sometimes I do. I've got to start copying and pasting these things from places rather than hand typing them in. I keep making spelling mistakes. Oh, it's the fun. It's the fun. It's me. All right, but no, these are getting bigger. These are getting more capable. And one of the things I would point out again is if you start looking at these classes, and you're going, okay, so they're getting bigger and more capable. So, but they're saying the same weight. How are they doing this? Well, if we consider with the G's and the H's, a good example, they're now also carrying depth charges. They're carrying a slightly different gun mount. They have, slightly upgraded themselves, and apparently they are lighter than their predecessors. It's one of the really fun things you have going on, is that sometimes you're looking at the stuff and you're going, so you're saying this is achieving a higher speed, better range, it's got better machinery, everything's improved in that regard, and it's carrying more weapons, and it's still lighter in standard displacement than its predecessor? Well, it's machinery efficiency improvements and all these things. Yes, I can believe that, but I'm not sure it counts for quite the same amount of tonnage you do. Because between the E and the Fs and the G and H's, they are pretty much bang on the same in terms of their stats, in terms of their systems and things going in them, and yet, according to the official stats given, there is 60 tons differential in their standard displacement. I've looked at the plans. I've gone over them. I can make the case for there being a differential. That bigger differential, I don't see it. But still, that's the figures they put in. And then you get to the I class. The I class are this really interesting class. They claim they are 1,390 tons in standard. Which, if we go back to HMS Amazon, well, she was 1,370 tons in standard. So they're claiming they're only 18 tons in standard more than her. And they carry 10 torpedoes in 2 quintuple launchers to her 6. Okay, so that means you have a bigger mechanism for torpedo launchers because it's a lot more weight for them to moving around. You're carrying more torpedoes. Okay, what else? Well, they're carrying depth charges, a rack and a couple of throwers, plus 20 depth charges. They've got 4.7-inch guns. That's roughly the same. They're carrying machine guns and pom-poms. They've got full ASDIC setup, which she didn't have. They can do 36 knots, and officially, and, well, 5,530 nautical miles at 15 knots, and she could do 3,400 nautical miles at 15 knots, or 5,340 nautical miles at 12.5 knots. Okay. She has 3 Admiralty free drum boilers. She has geared steam turbine, same as Amazon does. So looking at this going, for 18 tons more, I'm getting all this extra capability. And quite a few of the ships ended up also being fitted for mine laying and able to carry 60 mines. Now, I would like to point out that, like with the Brazilian vessels of the H-class, at least two of the I-class vessels, which were for the Turks, were against treaty regulations, were all purchased by the Royal Navy. You're not supposed to do this. It's technically, according to some of the treaties you sign up to in the 1920s, you're not supposed to do this. You're not supposed to compulsory purchase or purchase ships being built in your yards for other navies when war begins. It's bad. This was specifically put in the treaties as a rule because the Americans had seen the British do it in World War One. And they saw it as a way the Royal Navy had of rapidly increasing their fleet, and it upset their politicians. And they thought, if we make them sign a treaty against it, they won't ever do it again. I kid you not, in World War II, I think war was declared for like 30 seconds before the papers appeared. As I've said before, the ARA La Argentina, which is a triple turret version of an RFU, a triple 6-inch turret version of the Arafusa class, if she'd been hanging around for any longer, would have found herself held up until the Royal Navy was sure there wasn't going to be a war in 1939, and she would have been purchased. The I-class, though, are this big hitters. They are the class that come before the tribals, and they show really the end point of development of this first batch from Amazon. The first batch from Amazon. And what do I mean by the first batch from Amazon? I mean the first batch of post-World War I thinking. Guns matter, their ability to provide security for the fleet matters, but they are still built around the torpedo as that as the primus inter pares. It's that first amongst equal of their weapon system. And that is defining their shape and their form. The torpedoes, the ability for them to weight themselves so they can swing round to bring the torpedoes to bear, that they can do aggressive fighting, and also that the torpedo crews are going to be protected as they're going in because they've got all this in front of them. So whilst they're getting the torpedoes ready and they're heading towards the enemy, they are protected. They're in a protected position. And that, well, is enshrined from 1926 onwards to be built into the force. They're going to be aggressive, but they've got the tools to be aggressive with. They're going to be encouraged to be aggressive, but they're going to have the right command position and conditions to support that aggression, to allow them to develop themselves. And they're going to all have this all put into the right ships for the role. So Royal Navy destroyers are basically being built up, I would say, from the end of World War I and the Harwich Force, but realistically there's a couple of years while everything's being sorted out. And everything's sort of being reconditioned, especially with the war going on in Russia, the Russian Civil War that's turning into the Soviet Union, the Winter War, which the British are being part of, and other things going around the world as they're settling in force. And then definitely from 1924 onwards, they are consciously going, okay, we've got the lessons, we've got the understanding, we need to build this into our force structure, we need to develop this. But this is the first generation of that. This is really the first generation of that thinking, and they're going through and developing and testing. And it's no surprise to me that after they keep exercising these ships and they keep developing them, that by a certain point you reach a level of, oh good, we've got this idea sorted, but we need to push further. We need to do something more. And this is the point you reach the tribals. Because the Royal Navy have now worked through the destroyers and gone, okay, do we need to do something more with the guns? We've got the torpedoes, we've got everything sorted. Do we need to do something more with the guns? Do we need to start figuring out how these ships are going to get in? And you can do that because once you've got the I-class in, you've now got the ability to launch 10 torpedoes per destroyer. Now this matters, because if we go right the way back to the beginning of Amazon, she was 6 torpedoes. For the Royal Navy, they work in multiples of 10 to guarantee a hit. If you launch 10 torpedoes, you're likely to get 3 hits. If you launch 5 torpedoes, you're likely to get 1 hit. That's their theory. 6 torpedoes, you might get 1 hit. You might get 2, but you might get 1. 8 torpedoes, as you have for most of these classes. That's lovely. That's going to give you probably 1 hit, maybe 2. A good chance of 2 hits. Statistically, mathematically, if they're launching them as a combined salvo. But if they're launching them as individual salvos because they're dealing with an ongoing engagement and it's an ongoing fight, then that's not guaranteed. So you need to have multiple destroyers coordinating to fire these things, and they've got to work out tactics of working together. They've got to work together in a way which is seamless. That's another point about the whole thinking aggression. You've got to have crew which are going to be thinking not just about what they're doing, but what about the other ships are doing. There is a reason why the Royal Navy and the US Navy and lots of navies actually, by World War II, become destroyer navies. I know we hear a lot about battleship admirals, but realistically the destroyer officers start to dominate the senior positions. Why? Because they have to start doing fleet work and coordination of forces and other assets early. They start having to think about how they're going to integrate in a wider force early, because that is all they live for. Because a single destroyer attacking is great, but a group of 2, 4, 8 destroyers attacking, that's lethal. Because then you're not dealing with them launching maybe 4 or 8 torpedoes in this group, but if you've got 8 destroyers attacking, if you've got a full flotilla, 9 destroyers, including their leader, all attacking, taking part in attacks on you. And they've divided up into 120 degrees spheres, and they've got 3 coming from each of the 120s, in sort of gone to a sort of integrated divisional force, where each division has dropped 1 destroyer to go off with a leader, and the divisional leaders are taking a pair each. That's a standard Royal Navy tactic. That's a fairly similar US Navy tactic, which is based on that line, and there's also an Italian tactic which is similar. The French have a slightly different formation structure and how they put it together. And when they're going into these attacks, they've got to be thinking about what is each other doing, because you haven't got the time to radio and going, okay, enemy firing this way, I'm going to pull this way, and keep sending out constant messages and for them to be reading and reacting it. They don't have the time to react. You've got the reaction time is seconds. Not hours, not even minutes, it's seconds. So they've got to be watching, going, okay, they're moving, they're doing this, okay, we need to do this. You need to develop that level of thought in your system, and you need to encourage that level of thought in the system. And maybe one of the other destroyer commanders goes, well, captain, but they're probably not captain in rank, goes, hang on, my 2 mates are breaking that way. If I break this way, then I'm going to split the enemy's gunfire, and we're going to have more of a chance of getting our torpedoes in. So I'm going to split. That's allowed. That's encouraged. You're working within a group. And so when you go higher up and starting your cruisers or you're coordinating a fleet, you've got someone who's been doing it for an extra 5-10 years on any other officer, because they start off at a lieutenant commander's rank, whereas they might not, if they're in cruisers or in their capital ships, they definitely won't get anywhere near that kind of thought process away from their division and running their section till they are probably in the captain's seat as a captain. Because, and again, this all matters, if you go to torpedoes, if you're firing 4 or 8 torpedoes at a single target, okay, you have a chance of hitting. If you want to attack multiple targets, task group, and you're attacking with 9 destroyers, well, with these, you are launching 72 torpedoes at them, maybe. Or, potentially, you're launching 36 and then another road of 36. And that suddenly sends up your odds of killing something astronomically. Because, as said, for the Royal Navy, the maths they're working at is 1 for 5, 3 hits for 10, because it becomes more and more difficult for the enemy ships to comb the tracks. Because that's what is the best maneuver to avoid torpedoes is to comb the tracks. So if you've got torpedoes coming in this way, the best maneuver is to try and maneuver between them and comb them. Okay? That's more difficult to do if there are if there's, let's say, 2 sets of torpedoes coming at slightly different angles. Suddenly you're less likely, it's more difficult for you to comb them, and you're more likely to get hit. And once you hit once, you're more likely to hit a second time. Again, when you're facing a destroyer, this is how it works. So you have 36 torpedoes coming in. That's going to be more difficult, especially if you've got 12 coming from one side, 12 coming from one quadrant, 12 coming from 3 different quadrants at the same time. So suddenly you've got 12 torpedoes coming in from that direction, 12 from over there, and 12 from behind you. How do you break it? You try and twist off, but if you try and twist off, you might end up getting broadsided by those because they're going to be spreading out. Because they won't come in a straight line, they'll come in at a slightly spread angle. And there'll be sets of them. And then they might launch another one, a set. So you have, let's say you divide yourself up into 60-degree angles. The first wave might be coming in from this 60, this 60, and this 60, and then they'll all shift to this 60, and this 60 for the next ones. And then you've got basically 12 torpedo for every 5 degrees around you. Suddenly that's a difficult point to avoid. There are torpedoes coming at you from all directions. Now the thing is, getting that to work, as time goes on, becomes more and more difficult. So how do you get it to work once you're thinking about it from the point of view of, well, this point, the 1930s. Now you're going to be facing enemy destroyers, potentially enemy aircraft. You need something which has a bit of firepower to get them in there. And that's the point at which you start to get the tribals and the next generation of post-World War I building and the Royal Navy for building for World War II. Because your aim is still going, okay, well, I want each of my sets of destroyers to be carrying at least 24 torpedoes to make that work. Well, this carries 5. This carries 10. If I have 2 of these and 1 of these in an attack, I'm golden. I'm golden because that's 25 torpedoes. That means I haven't dropped from, 70. I haven't dropped down in torpedo numbers. It does mean I'm probably going to launch 15 in the first wave and 10 in the second wave. So that means there'll be a wave of 45 torpedoes coming in and a wave of 30 torpedoes coming in. But I can also fix that another way. I could maybe up my destroyer numbers, especially as the treaty starts to go, and I can build more destroyers. And so I can have 3 destroyers with 10 torpedoes and a tribal with more guns to provide them with the cover and the extra fighting capability to keep the enemy destroyers and enemy forces back from them with its 5 torpedoes. And then it might not even need to fire its torpedoes. It can use its torpedoes as a third wave of torpedoes. It could be you get 15, you get 45 coming in the first wave, 45 coming in the second wave, and then a third wave of 15 torpedoes coming in. And there have been 12 destroyers involved in the attack, but yeah, you have now got 105 torpedoes coming into you. And that's the kind of mass torpedo attack they're talking about when they talk about destroyers in this period. Now the thing is, that's a perfect fleet operation. That's a fleet when a fleet happens, when they've got everybody smoking, or preferably attack at night doing these things. That's what is a perfect scenario for the British. But the thing is, exercises rarely have that happen. That's a theoretical example. They regularly manage in exercises to get the box operation happen. That's when they would surround an individual ship or a couple of groups of ships, and they'd be offered each quadrant, boxing them in and stopping them being able to escape at night. So they, are there in the morning for battleships, etc., to engage if they're a major fleet unit. They're able to do that, but the whole fleet attack is something they dream of doing. They build up and practice doing, but in exercise it rarely works out like that. What they usually start working out with in exercise is, how are we going to make these things work? What goes where? And that's the other interesting point we have going on, which builds up into the tribal class and comes from this period, is the Royal Navy has this doctrine. They are encouraging aggression, but in many ways they're treating a doctrine as a list of suggestions, of ideas you can draw from, not necessarily what they're expecting you to do. It's a case of, this is a base point. Think about it. Maybe use it. Maybe don't use it. Maybe you have an idea based on it. We don't mind. What matters is, did you achieve your objective? And that goes for the whole destroyer force. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed that. I do always finish my videos with a question, and I'm not going to change now. The question is this. So the Royal Navy gets to do a lot of building of their destroyers. But the question I often think about myself is, what happens if they manage to get the twin 4.7-inch gun mount earlier? Because if you think about it, if you go back, there are some destroyer leaders with twins, but all these are mostly singles. And my theory has often been, if you get a twin 4.7-inch mount earlier that works, they'll end up going for 6-gun destroyers with 3 twin mounts, and will use the space for more depth charges to make their vessels generally more general purpose. But some people would argue that they might go for more torpedoes. I don't think it really works out that way, and I think it's going to be more difficult to claim that in the tonnage and the sand displacement arguments. But I'd really like to hear your opinions as to what they might do. There is, of course, the other option that they go for some sort of torpedo storage position and actual reloading systems to make reloading them quicker and easier under conditions rather than involving rope and tackle. But yeah, I think that's unlikely. But I'd really like to hear your thoughts on what you think happens if they get the double mount working earlier and are using it for more ships earlier. What else have we got coming up? Well, next week it's going to be the freest of the three navies, the Dutch destroyers of World War II. I think you're going to enjoy that. They do get up to some really interesting things. And then we're going on to the Cold War, the backbone of the Soviet fleet. Post-Cold War, the rise of the Chinese Navy. That's going to be the week of the 17th. That's the week I'm away teaching with Justin Craig, or rather, course directing. So that's going to be some interesting times. And then Pre-World War One, back to Pre-World War One, how Japan intimidated an empire. Ah, yes, the run-up to the Russo-Japanese War and Japan's torpedo boat/torpedo boat destroyers. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and take care. Toodles.